Hi class, this is your instructor, Scholar Huff, and we're now in Chapter 54, Ecology of Individuals and Populations. Ecology is the study of how organisms relate to one another and to their environments. And it is a complex and fascinating area of biology that has important implications for each of us. In our exploration of ecological principles, we'll first consider how organisms respond to the abiotic environment in which they exist and how these responses affect the properties of populations, emphasizing population dynamics. Hereafter, we will discuss communities of coexisting species and the interactions that occur among them, and then in chapters 56 through 58, we discuss the functioning of entire ecosystems of the biosphere, including with a consideration of the problems facing our planet and our fellow species. So as we go through this using the visual outline as presented in your textbook on page 1221, it will help you. So here we are. Let's get into it. The nature of the physical environment in large measure determines which organisms live in a particular climate or region. Key elements of the environment include temperature. Most organisms are adapted to live within a relatively narrow range of temperatures and will not thrive if temperatures are colder or warmer. The growing season of plants, for example, is importantly influenced by temperature. Water. All organisms require it. On land, water is often scarce, so patterns of rainfall have a major influence on life. Almost all ecosystems rely on energy captured by photosynthesis. Hence, sunlight influences, and the availability of sunlight influences the amount of life an ecosystem can support, particularly below the surface in marine communities. Soil. The physical consistency, the pH, and mineral composition of the soil often severely limit terrestrial plant growth, particularly the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus. An individual encountering environmental variation may maintain a steady state internal environment, a condition known as homeostasis, which will be taught about a bit later. Many animals and plants actively employ physiological, morphological, or behavioral mechanisms to maintain homeostasis. This beetle you see here is using a behavioral mechanism to cope with limited water availability. Other organisms and plants are known as conformers because they conform to the environment in which they find themselves, and their bodies adopting the temperature, the salinity, and other physical aspects of their surrounding. So responses to environmental variation can be seen over both the short and long term. In the short term, spanning periods of a few minutes to an individual's lifetime, organisms have a variety of ways of coping with environmental change. Over longer periods, natural selection can operate to make a population better adapted to its environment. During the course of a day, a season, or a lifetime, an individual organism must cope with a range of living conditions. Organisms do so through physiological, morphological, and behavioral abilities they possess. These abilities are the product of natural selection acting on a particular environmental setting over time, which explains why an individual organism that is moved to a different environment may not survive. Many organisms are able to respond to environmental change by making physiological adjustments. For example, you sweat when it is hot, increasing evaporative heat loss and thus preventing overheating. Similarly, people who visit high altitudes may initially experience altitude sickness, and the symptoms of which include heart palpitations, nausea, fatigue, headache, mental impairment, and in serious cases, pulmonary edema, because of the low atmospheric pressure and consequent lower oxygen availability in the air. After several days, however, the same people usually feel fine because a number of physiological changes have increased the delivery of oxygen in their body tissues. Some insects avoid freezing in the winter by adding glycerol, which is almost as if antifreeze, to their blood. Others tolerate freezing by converting much of their glycogen reserves into alcohols that protect their cell membranes from freezing damage. Animals that maintain a constant internal condition, endotherms, in a cold environment have adaptations that tend to minimize energy expenditure. For example, many mammals grow thicker coats during the winter, their fur acting as insulation to retain body heat. In general, the thicker the fur, the greater the insulation. Thus, a wolf's fur is about 3 times thicker in winter than in summer, and insulates more than twice as well. The ability of organisms to alter their morphology in response to environmental conditions is quite widespread. Plants, for example, will grow more extensive roots when water is limited and have larger leaves in shaded environments. Animals, too, can alter their physique. In the presence of predators, usually detected by smell, snails grow thicker shells. Daphnia develop spines. Tadpoles produce thicker tails to better swim quickly. The ability to produce multiple phenotypes from a single genotype is termed a norm of reaction. The existence of norms of reaction has several important consequences. Such flexibility is obviously useful to a species that may find itself in different environments, particularly sedentary species that cannot just get up and move. However, it's important to remember that such differences in phenotype among individuals do not reflect genetic differences. Rather, individuals may be genetically identical, but still have grown up in different environments. And then we're at behavioral responses. So many animals deal with the variation in the environment by moving from one patch of habitat to another, avoiding areas that are unsuitable. The tropical lizard manages to maintain a fairly uniform body temperature in an open habitat by basking in patches of sunlight to warm up, then retreating to shade when it becomes too hot. By contrast, in shaded forests, the same lizard does not have the opportunity to regulate its body temperature through behavioral means. Thus, it becomes a conformer and adopts the temperature of the surroundings. So we see each of those here. There we have the fur thickness example being shown to you there as a morphological capability. And then to the right hand side, this is the Puerto Rican crested lizard. Natural selection leads to evolutionary adaptation to environmental conditions. The ability of an individual to alter its physiology, morphology, or behavior is itself an evolutionary adaptation, the result of natural selection. The results of natural selection can be also detected by comparing populations of the same species that live in different environments. For example, as we've just seen, humans have the ability to acclimate physiologically to living at higher elevations. In addition, however, human populations can evolve adaptations for living at higher altitudes. So genetic research has shown that populations living at higher altitudes have evolved genetic changes that make them better suited for such environments. Organisms live as members of a population, which is defined as individuals of the same species that occur together in one place at and time. In the rest of this chapter, we will consider the properties of populations, focusing on factors that influence whether a population grows or shrinks, and at what rate. The explosive growth of the world's human population in the last few centuries provides a focus for our inquiry. The term population can be defined narrowly or broadly. This flexibility allows us to speak in similar terms for the world's human population, the population of protists in the gut of a termite, or the population of deer that inhabit a forest. Sometimes the boundaries defining a population are sharp, such as an edge of an isolated mountain lake for trout, and sometimes they're fuzzier, as when deer readily move back and forth between two forests separated by a cornfield. Three characteristics of population ecology are particularly important. 1. Population range, the area throughout which a population occurs. 2. The pattern of spacing of individuals within that range. And 3. How the population changes in size through time. No population, not even one composed of humans, occurs in all habitats throughout the world. Most species, in fact, have relatively limited geographic ranges, and the range of some species is minuscule. What you're looking at here is the devil's hole pupfish. It lives in a single spring in southern Nevada. And the Socorro isopod is known from a single spring system in New Mexico. At the other extreme, some species are widely distributed. The common dolphin, for example, is found throughout all the world's oceans. So organisms must be adapted to the environment in which they occur. Polar bears are exquisitely adapted to survive in the cold of the Arctic, but you won't find them in tropical rainforests. Certain prokaryotes can live in near boiling waters of Yellowstone's geysers, but they do not occur in cooler streams nearby. Each population has its own requirements: temperature, humidity, certain types of food, and a host of other factors that determine where it can live and reproduce and where it can't. In addition, in places that are otherwise suitable, the presence of predators, competitors, or parasites may prevent a population from occupying an area. Population ranges are not static but change through time. These changes occur for two reasons. In some cases, the environment changes. As the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 years ago, many North American plant and animal populations expanded northward. At the same time, climates warmed. Species experienced shifts in elevation, in the elevation in which they could live, as you can now see here. In addition, populations can expand their ranges when they are able to circumvent inhospitable habitat and colonize suitable previously unoccupied areas. For example, the cattle egret is native to Africa. Sometime in the late 1800s, these birds appeared in northern South America. Having made it nearly 3,500 kilometers transatlantic crossing, perhaps aided by strong winds, since then they have steadily expanded their range and now can be found throughout most of the United States, including even here in Baldwin County. The human effect. By altering the environment, humans have allowed some species, such as coyotes, to expand their ranges and move to areas they previously did not occupy. Moreover, humans have served as an agent of dispersal for many species. Some of these transplants have been wildly successful. For example, when hunter-starlings were introduced in New York City in 1896 in a misguided attempt to establish every species of bird mentioned by Shakespeare. Their population steadily spread so that by 1980, they occurred throughout the United States. Similar stories could be told for countless plants and animals, and the list increases every year. Unfortunately, the success of these invaders often comes at the expense of native species. Dispersal mechanisms. Dispersal to new areas can occur in many ways. Lizards have colonized many distant islands, as one example probably due to individuals or their eggs floating or drifting on vegetation. Bats are the only mammals on many distant islands because they can fly to them. Seeds of plants are designed to disperse in many ways, as you can see here. Some seeds are aerodynamically designed to be blown long distances by wind. Others have structures that stick to the fur of animals, so they are carried long distances before falling to the ground. Still others are enclosed in fleshy fruits. These seeds can pass through the digestive systems of mammals or birds, then germinate where they are defecated. Finally, seeds of mistletoes are violently propelled from the base of the fruit in an explosive discharge termed explosive dehiscence. Although the probability of long-distance dispersal event leading to successful establishment of new population is low, over millions of years, many such dispersals have occurred. And if you look closely, I think you all may recognize some of those fruits. Another key characteristic of population structure is the way in which individuals of a population are distributed. They may be randomly spaced, uniformly spaced, or merely clumped. Random spacing of individuals within populations occur when they do not interact strongly with one another and when they are not affected by uniform aspects of their environment. Random distributions are not common in nature. Some species of trees, however, appear to exhibit random distributions in Panamanian rainforests. Uniform spacing within a population often results from competition for resources. This spacing is accomplished in many different ways. In animals, uniform spacing often results from behavioral interactions. In many species, individuals of one or both sexes defend a territory from which other individuals are excluded. These territories provide the owner with exclusive access to resources such as food, water, hiding refuges, or mates, and can space individuals evenly across the habitat if the resources themselves are evenly distributed. Even in non-territorial species, individuals often maintain a defended space into which other animals are not allowed to intrude. Among plants, uniform spacing is also a common result of competition for resources. Closely spaced individual plants compete for available sunlight, nutrients, and water. These contests can be direct, as when one plant casts a shadow over another, or indirect, as when two plants compete by extracting nutrients or water from a shared area. In addition, some plants, such as the creosote bush, produce chemicals in the surrounding soil that are toxic to other members of their species. In all of these cases, only plants that are spaced an adequate distance from each other will be able to coexist, leading to uniform spacing. Clumped spacing. Individuals clump into groups or clusters in response to uneven distribution of resources in their immediate environments. Clump distributions are common in nature because individual animals, plants, and microorganisms tend to occur in habitats defined by soil type, moisture, and other aspects of the environment which they are best adapted. Social interactions can also lead to clump distributions. Many species live and move in larger groups, which go by a variety of names, such as a pride, a herd, or flock. These groupings can provide many advantages, including increased awareness of and defense against predators, decreased energy costs of moving through the air and water, and access to the knowledge of all group members. On a broader scale, populations are often most densely populated in the interior of their range and less densely distributed toward the edges. Such patterns usually result from the manner in which the environment changes in different areas. Populations are often best adapted to the conditions in the interior of their distribution. As environmental conditions change, individuals are less well adapted, and thus densities decrease. Ultimately, the point is reached at which individuals cannot persist at all, and this marks the edge of a population's range. A species often exists as a network of distinct populations that exchange individuals. Such networks are termed metapopulations. which usually occur in areas in which suitable habitat is patchily dispersed and separated by intervening stretches of unsuitable habitat. The degree to which populations within a metapopulation interact depends on the amount of dispersal. This interaction is often not symmetrical. Populations increasing in size tend to send out many dispersers, whereas populations at low levels tend to receive more immigrants than they send off. In addition, relatively isolated populations tend to receive relatively few arrivals. A species may also exhibit a metapopulation structure in areas in which some habitats are suitable for long-term population maintenance, but others are not. In these situations, termed source sink metapopulations, the populations in the better areas, the sources, continually send out dispersers that bolster the populations in the poorer habitats, the sinks. In the absence of such continual replenishment, sink populations would have a negative growth rate and eventually become extinct. So here you're being presented with the Glanville fritillary butterfly. It occurs in metapopulations in southwestern Finland, on the Åland Islands, and none of the population is large enough to survive for long on its own, but continual immigration of individuals from other populations allows some populations to survive. In addition, continual establishment of new populations tends to offset extinction of established populations, although in recent years extinctions have outnumbered colonizations. The dynamics of a population, how it changes through time, are affected by many factors. One important factor is the age distribution of individuals. That is, what proportion of individuals are adults, juveniles, and young. Demography is the quantitative study of populations. How the size of a population changes through time can be studied at two levels, as a whole or broken down into parts. The most inclusive level, we can study the whole population to determine whether it is increasing, decreasing, or remaining constant. Put simply, populations grow if births outnumber deaths, and shrink if deaths outnumber births, ignoring for the moment immigration or immigration. Understanding these trends is often easier. However, if we break the population into smaller units composed of individuals of the same age, for example 1-year-olds, study the factors affecting birth and death rates for each unit separately. Population growth can be influenced by the population's sex ratio. The number of births in a population is usually directly related to the number of females. Births may not be as closely related to the number of males in a species, in which a single male can mate with several females. In many species, males compete for the opportunity to mate with females. Consequently, females have many matings and many males do not mate at all. In such species, the sex ratio of reproducing animals is female biased and does not affect population growth rates. Reduction in the number of males simply changes the identities of the reproductive males without reducing the number of births. By contrast, among monogamous species, pairs may form long-lasting reproductive relationships, and a reduction in the number of males can then directly reduce the number of births. Generation time is the average interval between the birth of an individual and the birth of its offspring. This factor can also affect population growth rates. A group of individuals of the same age is referred to as a cohort. In most species, the probability that an individual will reproduce or die varies throughout its lifespan. As a result, within a population, every cohort has a characteristic birth rate or fecundity rate, defined as the number of offspring produced in a standard time, for example, per year, and a characteristic of death rate or mortality rate, which is the number of individuals that die in that period. The relative number of individuals in each cohort defines a population's age structure. Because different cohorts have different fecundity and death rates, age structure has a critical influence on a population's growth rate. Populations with a large proportion of young individuals, for example, tend to grow rapidly because an increasing proportion of their individuals are reproductive. Human populations in many developing countries are an example, as will be discussed later on. Conversely, if a large proportion of a population is relatively old, populations may decline. This phenomenon now characterizes China, Japan, South Korea, and a number of countries in Europe. To assess how populations in nature are changing, ecologists use a life table, which tabulates the fate of a cohort from birth until death, showing the number of offspring produced and the number of individuals that die in each time period. The table shown to you now is an example of a life table analysis from a study of the annual bluegrass. This study follows the fate of 843 individuals through time, charting how many survive in each interval and how many offspring each survivor produces. In this table, the first column indicates age of the cohort, that is, the number of 3-month intervals from the start of the study. The second and third columns indicate the number of survivors and the proportion of the original cohort still alive at the beginning of that interval. The fifth column presents the mortality rate, the proportion of individuals that started that age interval alive but died at the end of it. The seventh column indicates the average number of seeds produced by each surviving individual in that interval. The last column shows the number of seeds produced relative to the size of the original cohort. Much can be learned by examining life tables. In the case of the annual bluegrass, we see that both the probability of dying and the number of offspring produced per surviving individual steadily increases with age. By adding the numbers in the last column, we get the total number of offspring produced per individual in the initial cohort. This number is almost 2, which means that for every original member of the cohort, on average, 2 new individuals have been produced. A value of 1 will be the break-even number, the point at which the population was neither growing nor shrinking. In this case, the population appears to be growing rapidly. In most cases, life table analysis is more complicated than this. First, except for organisms with short lifespans, it is difficult to track the fate of a cohort until the death of the last individual. An alternative approach is to construct a cross-sectional study, examining the fate of cohorts of different ages in a single period. In addition, many factors such as offspring reproducing before all members of the parents' cohort have died complicate the interpretation of individual populations are growing or shrinking. The percentage of an individual population that survives to a given age is called survivorship. One way to express some aspects of the age distribution of populations is through a survivorship curve. Examples of different survivorship curves are shown. Oysters produced vast numbers of offspring, only a few of which live to reproduce. However, once they become established and grow into reproductive individuals, their mortality rate is extremely low. Type 3 survivorship curve. In Hydra, animals related to jellyfish, individuals are equally likely to die at any age. The result is a straight survivorship curve, type 2. Finally, mortality rates in humans, as in many other animals and in protists, rise steeply later in life, type 1 survivorship curve. Of course, these descriptions are just generalizations, and many organisms show more complicated patterns. Here you're seeing a survivorship curve for a cohort of annual bluegrass. After 7 months of age, mortality occurs at a constant rate through time. Natural selection favors traits that maximize the number of surviving offspring left in the next generation by an individual organism. Two factors affect this quantity: how long an individual lives and how many young it produces each year. Why doesn't every organism reproduce immediately after its own birth, produce large families of an offspring, care for them intensively, and perform these functions repeatedly throughout a long life? The answer is that usually no one organism can do all of this, simply because not enough resources are available. Consequently, organisms allocate resources to either to current reproduction or to increase their prospects for surviving and reproducing at later life stages. Age at first reproduction correlates with lifespan. Long-lived species delay reproduction, and the advantage is that juveniles gain experience but with a high cost of reproduction, and short-lived species reproduce early. Time is important. Delay may mean no offspring. Populations often remain at a relatively constant size, regardless of how many offspring are born. As you have now learned, Darwin based his theory of natural selection partly on this seeming contradiction. Natural selection occurs because of checks on reproduction, with some individuals producing fewer surviving offspring than others. To understand populations, we must consider how they grow and what factors in nature limit population growth. The rate of population increase, R, is defined as the difference between the birth rate and death rate. And death rate is corrected for movement of individuals into or out of the population. Thus, movements of individuals can have a major influence on population growth rates. For example, the increase in human population in the United States during closing decades of the 20th century was mostly due to immigration. And note, E is the rate of individuals moving out of the area or exiting, and I is the rate of movement into the area. The simplest model of population growth assumes that the population grows without limits at its maximal rate, and also that rates of immigration are equal. This rate, called the biotic potential, is the rate at which a population of a given species increases when no limits are placed on its rate of growth. In mathematical terms, this is defined by the formula shown here, where n is the number of individuals in the population, delta n divided by delta t is the rate of change in the numbers over time, and r sub I is the intrinsic rate of natural increase for that population, its innate capacity for growth. The biotic potential of any population is exponential. And let's go to that now. It's shown here in red. Even when the rate of increase remains constant, the actual number of individuals accelerates rapidly as the size of the population grows. The result of unchecked exponential growth is a population explosion. No matter how rapidly populations grow, they eventually reach a limit imposed by shortages of important environmental factors such as space, light, water, or nutrients. A population ultimately may stabilize at a certain size called carrying capacity of the particular place where it lives. The carrying capacity is symbolized by K, is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can support. As a population approaches its carrying capacity, its rate of growth slows greatly because fewer resources remain for each new individual to use. The growth curve of such population, which is always limited by one or more factors in the environment, can be approximated by the following logistic growth equation shown here. In this model of population growth, the growth rate of the population is equal to its intrinsic rate of natural increase adjusted for the amount of resource available. The adjustment is made by multiplying the rate of n by the fraction of k, the carrying capacity, still unused. As n increases, the fraction of resources by which r is multiplied becomes smaller and smaller, and the rate of increase of the population declines. Graphically, if you plot n versus t, which is time, you obtain a sigmoidal growth curve, characteristic of many biological populations. The curve is called sigmoidal because its shape has a double curve like the letter S. So you may hear me refer to it as a S-shaped curve. As the size of the population stabilizes at carrying capacity, its rate of growth slows, eventually coming to a halt, which you see now in the blue line. Notice that the population tends to move toward carrying capacity regardless of whether it is initially above or below it. For this reason, logistic growth tends to return a population to the same size. In this sense, such populations are considered to be in equilibrium because they would be expected to be at or near the carrying capacity at most times. In many cases, real populations display trends corresponding to a logistic growth curve. This is true not only in the laboratory, but also in natural populations. So a fur seal population on St. Paul Island is shown to you here. And then two laboratory populations of the Ch54. And note that the populations first exceeded the carrying capacity before decreasing to a size that was then maintained. A number of factors may affect population size through time. Some of these factors depend on population size and are therefore termed density dependent. Other factors, such as natural disasters, affect populations regardless of size. These factors are termed density independent. Many populations exhibit cyclic fluctuations in size that may result from complex interactions of factors. The reason population growth rates are affected by population size is that many important processes have density-dependent effects. That is, as population size increases, either reproductive rates decline or mortality rates increase, or both, a phenomenon termed as negative feedback. Populations can be regulated in many different ways. When populations approach their carrying capacity, competition for resources can be severe, leading to both a decreased birth rate and an increased risk of death, which you're seeing here. In addition, predators often focus their attention on a particular common prey species, which also results in increasing rates of mortality as populations increase. High population densities can also lead to an accumulation of toxic wastes in the environment. Behavior changes may also affect population growth rates. Some species of rodents, for example, become antisocial, fighting more, breeding less, and generally acting stressed out. These behavioral changes result from hormonal actions, but their ultimate cause is not yet clear. Most likely they have evolved as adaptive responses to situations in which resources are scarce. In addition, in crowded populations, the population growth rate may decrease because of an increased rate of immigration of individuals attempting to find better conditions elsewhere. However, not all density-dependent factors are negatively related to population size. In some cases, growth rates increase with population size. This phenomenon is referred to as the Ali effect and is an example of positive feedback. So this is a major threat for endangered species. The reason why is here. So the Ali effect can take several forms, most obviously in populations that are too sparsely distributed. Individuals may have difficulty finding mates. Moreover, some species may rely on large groups to deter predators or to provide the necessary stimulation for breeding activities. The Ali effect is a major threat to endangered species, which may never recover from decreased population sizes caused by habitat destruction, overexploitation, or other causes. Density-independent effects. So growth rates in populations sometimes do not correspond to the logistic growth equation. In many cases, such patterns result because growth is under control of density-independent effects. In other words, the rate of growth of a population at any instant is limited by something unrelated to the size of the population. A variety of factors may affect populations in a density-independent manner. Most of these are aspects of the external environment, such as extremely cold winters, droughts, storms, or volcanic eruptions. Individuals often are affected by these occurrences regardless of size of the population. Populations in these areas where such events occur relatively frequently display erratic growth patterns in which populations increase rapidly when conditions are benign, but exhibit large reductions whenever the environment turns hostile. Needless to say, such populations do not produce the sigmoidal growth curves characteristic of the logistic equation. Fluctuations in the number of pupae of 4 moth species in Germany is shown to you here. Same factor regulating population size of different species. So in some populations, density-dependent effects lead not to equilibrium population size, but to cyclic patterns of increase and decrease. One such example is in the North American snowshoe hare, which follows a 10-year cycle. Though in reality, it's more like an 8-year to an 11-year cycle. So the hare population numbers, they fall 10-fold to 30-fold in a typical cycle, and 100-fold changes can occur. 2 factors appear to be generating the cycle: food plants and predators. And you're seeing this over time. As you have seen, some species usually maintain stable population sizes near the carrying capacity, whereas in other species population size fluctuate markedly and are often far below carrying capacity. The selective factors affecting such species differ markedly. Individuals in populations near their carrying capacity may face stiff competition for limited resources. By contrast, Individuals in populations far below carrying capacity have access to abundant resources. When resources are limited, the cost of reproduction often will be very high. Consequently, selection will favor individuals that can compete effectively and utilize resources efficiently. Such adaptations often come at a cost of lowered reproductive rates, as organisms wait longer to reproduce so that they can grow larger and stronger and produce fewer, larger offspring. Such populations are termed K-selected because they are adapted to thrive when the population is near its carrying capacity. Please be sure to see Table 54.3 with typical features of K-selected populations. Examples of K-selected species include coconut palms, whooping cranes, whales, and humans. By contrast, in populations far below the carrying capacity, resources may be abundant, costs of reproduction are low, and selection favors those individuals that can reproduce the maximum number of offspring. Selection here favors individuals with the highest reproductive rates. Such populations are termed R-selected. Examples of organisms displaying R-selected life history adaptations include dandelions, aphids, mice, and cockroaches. Most natural populations show life history adaptations that exist along a continuum ranging from completely R-selected traits to completely K-selected traits. Although these tendencies hold true in general, few populations are purely R or K selected and show all traits listed before you as you see here. These attributes should be treated as generalities with recognitions that many exceptions exist. Please review this. Briefly, with human population growth, humans exhibit many K-selected life history traits, including small brood size, late reproduction, a high degree of parental care. These life history traits evolved during the early history of hominins, when the limited resources available from the environment controlled population size. Throughout most of human history, our populations have been regulated by food availability, disease, and predators. Although unusual disturbances, including floods, plagues, and droughts, no doubt affected the pattern of human population growth, the overall size of the human population grew slowly during our early history. 2,000 years ago, perhaps 130 million people populated Earth. It took 1,000 years for that number to double, and it was 1,650 before it doubled again to about 500 million. In other words, for most of its existence, the human population was characterized by very slow growth. In this respect, human populations resembled many other species with predominantly K-selected life history adaptations. Starting in the early 1700s, changes in technology gave humans more control over their food supply. It enabled them to develop superior weapons to ward off predators and led to the development of cures for many diseases. At the same time, improvements in shelter and storage capabilities made humans less vulnerable to climatic uncertainties. These changes allowed humans to expand the carrying capacity of the habitats in which they lived, and thus to escape the confines of logistic growth and re-enter the exponential phase of the sigmoidal growth curve. Responding to the lack of environmental constraints, the human population has grown explosively over the last 300 years. Although the birth rate has decreased over time, the death rate has decreased at a much greater extent. The difference between birth and death rates meant that the population grew as much as 2% a year, although that rate has now declined to 0.9% per year. A 0.9% annual growth rate may not seem large, but it has produced a current human population of greater than 8 billion people. shown to you here. On the left, figure 5424. At this growth rate, more than 70 million people would be added to the world in the next year, and the human population would double in 77 years. Both the current human population level and the projected growth rate have potentially grave consequences for our future. So Earth's rapidly growing human population constitutes perhaps the greatest challenge of the future of the biosphere. Uneven distribution of population among countries is one thing as well, and then an increasing gap between the rich and poor. The world ecosystem is already under stress. And what is K for the human population? Are we already there? Will we ever get there? And don't forget about Malthus, the essay on the principle of populations. Hopefully you all learned about this back in Principles of Biology 1, as you all learned about evolution and natural selection. So Earth's rapidly growing human population constitutes perhaps the greatest challenge to the future of our biosphere. So the population growth rate, though it has declined, so nonetheless, because of the larger population, this amounts to an increase of about more than 70 million people per year to the world's population, compared to 53 million per year in the 1960s. So consumption in the developed world further depletes resources. And I think you see differences between a high developed versus those moderately developed, and one that is poorly developed when it comes to fertility rate, population growth rate, doubling time, infant mortality, and that's per 1,000 births, life expectancy, per capita gross domestic product, and then the population that is less than 15 years old and its percentage. So one way of looking at the disparity in the consumption of the developed world is by calculating the ecological footprint, which is the total amount of productive land required to support the individuals at the standard of living of a particular population through the course of their lives. This figure estimates the acreage, and I'll go to that now, used for the production of food, both plant and animal, forest products and housing, as well as the area of forest required to absorb the carbon dioxide produced by the combustion of fossil fuels. In other words, the wealthiest 20% of the world's population accounts for 86% consumption of the world's resources and produces 53% of the CO2 emissions, whereas the poorest countries, 20% is responsible for 1.3% of consumption and only 3% of CO2 emissions. So as I show this next figure here, the ecological footprint of an individual in the United States is nearly 8 times greater than someone in Nigeria. Based on these measurements, researchers have calculated that resource use by humans is now 1/3 greater than the amount that nature can sustainably replace. Moreover, consumption is increasing rapidly in the developing world. If all humans lived at the standard of living in the industrialized world, 2 additional planet Earths would be needed. So building a sustainable world is the most important task facing humanity's future. The quality of life available to our children will depend, to a large extent, on our success in limiting both population growth and the amount of per capita resource consumption. And this is from your textbook, if you're wondering about the source. Pandemics and human health. I'll be here briefly, you all. One thing I shall say is that history shows that human populations too have been affected by disease outbreaks. The term pandemic is now commonly used to refer to a widespread disease outbreak extending over multiple countries and even continents. Usually in reference to human populations. So an epidemic is the term for a more localized outbreak. So perhaps the most notorious human pandemic is the bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium and spread by fleas through contact with infected individuals. This was one of a series of plagues caused over the last 1,000 years, with Black Death being the worst. This pandemic killed a third of the population of Europe in the 14th century. In more recent times, the Spanish flu killed more than 50 million people in 1918 and 1919. And the global toll of COVID-19 that erupted in 2020 is officially over 7 million, but the real number, including many unreported deaths, may be several times that amount. So I say this to say that in 2020, the number of births per capita was less than the number of deaths per capita. And that happened for the first time in over 1,200 years, and that was in 2020. During that same year, in 25 of the 50 states, that was the case, which includes Alabama, meaning there were less births than deaths in 2020. And the last thing I'll mention is more people died in 2020 than were born. I repeat, more people died in 2020 than were born, and that was the first time on record for that to have occurred as well. So pandemics, as they do occur, it's when host individuals do not have the adequate immune system defenses, which primarily may be because of a lack of exposure or even because of the evolution of the pathogen. So I'll go down to the COVID-19, or at least to what's known as COVID-19. So some individuals transmit the virus more than others, and it is estimated that 10% of the people infected with the virus led to 80% of subsequent infections. And herd immunity is the phenomenon that occurs when the proportion of those immune in the population is large enough to stop the spread of the disease. And it's often around 70%. So it can occur from actual illness, or as you see right there, the last word on this slide, vaccination. So given enough time, herd immunity will develop in a population, assuming that individuals are able to become immune, but it comes at a high cost of a large proportion of the population being exposed to the pathogen and potentially suffering adverse consequences. So that alternative approach to developing herd immunity is through vaccines, which led to a large proportion of the population becoming immune without being affected. Vaccines have been effective at completely eliminating many terrible diseases, such as smallpox and rinderpest, and bringing many others under control. Their widespread use against COVID-19, along with the great number of people who have been infected since the beginning of the pandemic, has decreased the incidence and the severity of the disease, so much that COVID-19 is considered by many to now be just another seasonal respiratory virus like the flu. So this has been your instructor, Skylar Huff. Make sure you all prepare well for your test. Thank you all for listening and learning.